Thank you everyone for being here. This panel focuses how AI can enhance adult learning, upskill workers, and bridge education to employment gaps. Discussions will also address how higher education institutions can integrate AI into teaching. Our speakers for this great panel are Charles Fadel. He's a futurist inventor, founder, and chairman of the Center for Curriculum Redesign. He's a chair of education committee at OECD, co-author of Artificial Intelligence in Education, and the best-selling book, 21st Century Skills. He has worked with education systems and institutions in more than 30 countries, and spent 25 years in technology management. Judith is an assistant professor at Georgia Institute of Technology School of Interactive Computing and directs the Play and Learn Lab. She designs culturally informed computer science curriculum education technologies for students from low-income communities. Her research has contributed to programmable video games co-designed with diverse groups of children that have reached over 1 million students. And we also have Rem, who is an associate professor of business administration at the Harvard Business School. He is the co-director and co-founder of the Tech for All Lab at the Digital Data and Design, D3 Institute at Harvard, where he leads a group of researchers studying how entrepreneurs can accelerate AI to benefit all of humanity. And the conversation will be moderated by Danny Kim, master's students in the Learning, Design, Innovation, and Technology program at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. She's part of the 2025 cohort of student leaders in AI at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society. Her current work focuses on AI literacy for educators and students in K-12 and higher education contexts. We please give them a round of applause to our panelists.
All right, hi everyone. And thank you for organizing this, and thank you for inviting me on this panel. So I was trained as an engineer, and I started dabbling with AI back in 1989. Yes, I know most of you were not born by then, but it gave me a bit of depth into seeing what's real and what's fake in everything we were talking about. So of course, as usual, AI is going through a hype cycle. You know, we talk about Gen AI, it's already going down the hype cycle. And of course, if you're trying to raise billions of dollars, you're trying to maintain it as high as possible. And there's still a lot of chatter about artificial general intelligence, which means an intelligence that beats all of humans, although that definition keeps shifting by the day. And basically, the definition of Google and OpenAI is whatever our product roadmap is, we'll call that AGI. Next.
Yeah, that's not working.
So, in spite of all the hype, this phase, even if we stop immediately any progress on AI, will still be incredibly powerful. This is really the engineering phase, not the science phase of AI, where a bunch of things are being done that are really making all these things a lot more useful. So we still have algorithmic progress, but we have a lot of competition. I mean, you saw what emerged out of China with DeepSeek. We have vertical corpora, meaning specializing in healthcare, education, etc. We have faster hardware, etc., etc. And very recently, this week, OpenAI decided to take the protocol, the communications protocol of Anthropic, which is really powerful. Now the agents are able to communicate with one another, which could have been a big problem. That's not a really computing company think. They think in terms of me and that's it. Next. So to reach AGI, we're going to have to do more than language models, and basically figure out how to analyze symbolic AI of the 1980s with Martin Minsky on the other side of Cambridge, and what's been done with machine learning in recent times, which are the other types of technologies. We're going to get there in the next 10 to 30 years. Who knows? You cannot predict breakthroughs, but we're going to take breakthroughs, right? So, yeah, we cannot predict breakthroughs because we are a bit like this Jean-Marc Coté in 1899 trying to figure out how a robot would clean floors with the technology of the day. Right? There was only mechanical engineering, there was no electronics, there was no small, cheap engines, electrical motors, and so that's all he could come up with. Next, he could never have imagined robots. And so we're living in that situation. How can you imagine a world of 20 years from now at the pace of change we have? You can't. So next, what we kind of know very crudely is that the AI can already do the entire cognitive stack. Next. It can do most of the affective stack. Next. And it can do most of the psychomotor stack. Next. So of course, we're going to freak out and have to figure out what's left for us to do. So if you think about, we still are going to need knowledge. What type of knowledge we'll discuss in a second. We're still going to be needing how to use our knowledge, how we behave and engage in the world, and how we reflect and adapt. Next. Thank you. So, knowledge side, of course you still need to scaffold the students. You're not going to just play video games for 20 years and then suddenly figure out how to use AI. You need to learn, train your brain, and learn how to learn. So, what this means that rather than just going for the declarative, meaning the memorization aspects, the procedural knowledge aspects of knowledge, you have to also move up to the conceptual aspects and the epistemic aspects of any discipline. We don't do that. Very often, we just stay at the bottom rungs. Simple example, how many of you in math class, having studied exponentials, were told exponentials are deceiving than explosive? That's the concept behind the content. It's this layer. So imagine for a second if everybody had learned deceiving than explosive, we would have saved ourselves trillions of dollars during the pandemic because we would have reacted fast, knowing that, oh my God, it's deceiving than explosive. So just a very simple example to say, we got to go up the layers and this pyramid becomes more of a trapeze. Next. So of course you need competencies like creativity, critical thinking, etc. But you also need to look at whether AI can complement or not, whether AI can catch up, and what the new emphasis needs to be in terms of humans. So for instance, creativity. You have those vapid debates about, oh, humans are never going to be caught up with, like for chess, and therefore, we'll always be at the top of the world. No. AI can do incremental innovation just as much as humans do incremental innovation. Because they have an enormous corpus, and if you say, one razor blade, two razor blades, what do you think comes next? Three razor blades. Four razor blades, five razor blades. It's simple extrapolation. AI can do that. However, coming up with a pivoting head for your shaver, that's different. That's imagination. That's very, very different. And so AI is going to push us into specific segments of these competencies, which you see listed here. So not just critical thinking, but decision making. Not just communication, but dialogue, etc. Next please. And one more. And you see what I circled at the bottom. Adaptability and self-directed learning. This is what a university's final goal is. Right, we're talking about higher ed. So if your students don't graduate with this adaptability and self-directed learning, what have you done? Sure, you have taught them advanced biotechnology or whatever, or advanced law, since we're the law in here. But if they're not adaptable, how are they going to figure out what to do next by themselves? Because they're going to be having to figure it out. And so they need to be self-directed learners. We'll talk a lot more about that. I know that some of my colleagues will bring this up as well. Next. So you have to go into the details of what each one of these competencies means. It's not just creativity. It's different components of something like creativity or collaboration or whatever, and figure out what AI cannot do now and in the future. Next. Furthermore, why would I bother learning if I'm going to be, helped by all these AI? Why should I bother learning anything? Well, because I need to be motivated now to have a sense of purpose, a sense of agency in what I'm learning, so it actually helps me move forward. Thank you for the reprieve. Next. I'm almost done. So, you know the Ikigai. You have to figure out why you're doing something, what's your purpose behind it. Next. And very often people talk about, well, you can pass the test, the legal tests, the medical test, therefore you can do the job of a lawyer or not. No. Next. Because here's the analogy, just being a cleaning agent doesn't mean you are a washing machine. Doesn't mean that you can do the laundry. Right? Different is the test, that's a job. Right. I mean, who does the smell test if you're just a washing machine? So that's where economists fall, because they're always using the same word, skill, everything is a skill. There's a difference in the layer of abstraction of a quote-unquote skill. And that's really complicated to understand. Next. New jobs emerge. We don't know what they are up front, but hey, there are people who make money being influencers. I still can't believe it's a job, but it is. Next. And so we have to think about, yes, the AI is going to be hitting some of the things we do, but it's also going to expand into other things we cannot even conceive of. For instance, cyber anthropologists. The anthropologist who's going to look at the families of agents online and see, they're acting with each other in strange ways. And we observe that, right? Next. So, this is essentially just going to require versatility. This is going to go a bit against the mindset of higher ed, which is to specialize you and to push you forward. But I'm saying to students here, do not neglect your general courses in the first 2 years. They're actually the ones that are going to be more helpful than just your specialization. I know you just want an easy A. No, those are the courses to pay attention to. Next. So yeah, we're talking about a T-shaped person at IBM. You need to be broad and deep, not just deep. You need to have all the tools in your toolkit because you have no idea how AI is going to whack you in your discipline. Next. Next. So yeah, time to start. Sense of urgency, please. And so you can read it on the last one in case people want to find out more. I will give it in seconds. And I'm very glad that my colleague Grace Edie has been kind about this book. All right.
Hello. All right. Nice to see you all again. This is just pretty much an introduction of the kind of work that I do and the kinds of AI problems that I worry about. And I'm hoping that I can kind of help shape the conversation so we can get the right questions. So I design culturally informed education technologies and broaden participation in computer science education. That means that I make sure that people who have the least access to computer science education figure out ways to give them access. And I design things that make learning computer science fun and cool. I do this through co-design with families and math and computer science interventions in after-school programs. I also do video game design. So I've done a lot of computer programming games. A lot of them are really popular. And also like AI game design. And this is a way to get student voice into the things that we make. I also do a lot of co-design and professional development partnership with teachers, both in Atlanta, because I live in Atlanta, and in Ghana, West Africa. My AI-related work, right now, the thing that I spend a lot of my time thinking about is designing the AI, the middle school AI curriculum that is used in the state of Georgia. It's called AI-4GA. And I lead co-design with teachers there. So far, we work with about 24 teachers across 3 cohorts, 15 schools. The curriculum is publicly available. I can share the slides for the teachers in the room, but we've reached over almost 2,000 students now with the things that we make. Again, I'm not talking about that today. I'll send the slides. If you care about this work, there's a bunch of applications that you can talk. But my international work, when it really comes to creating sustainable K-12 CS curriculums in Ghana, and when you think about schools in Africa, you have a picture in your mind. And that picture varies depending on your experience. Like if you've traveled to Africa a lot, if you come from Africa, if you've only seen Africa in the media, right? You have a picture in your mind. And so some people think this is the school if you only think about rural areas. Other people think about large public schools that have a lot of students in the classroom. Other people think of super wealthy schools, and there's a broad spectrum of schools. Regardless of what perspective you have about African schools, only 1% of African children leave school with basic coding skills. So there's a lot of opportunity there to advance computer science education. And so one of the biggest problems that we see, especially in the rural areas, is it's very difficult to recruit teachers, right? About almost 40% of teachers can be absent for 2 or more days in a week in the one research study. So that's a big gap. And with large class sizes, this is typical of public schools. We have 200 sometimes students in a class to 1 teacher. So gradient feedback is impossible. And so there's a lot of, if you think about AI, like personalized instruction in this kind of setting, you can just think immediate automation of time-consuming tasks, individualized students' feedback and tutoring, generation of teaching materials, teaching plans, facilitating peer-to-peer support. These are things that just because of the scale of the classrooms, teachers need help with. So that's in the large classrooms. The problem that I spend a lot of my time thinking about is AI applications for computer science teacher professional development in Ghana. And this is informed by work that we've been doing recently, talking to teachers and talking to administrators. So this is like a short paper that we sent to SIGSI recently. And we're showing that for a lot of the teachers that we've spoken to, most of them, so the top 2 bars, this is a chart in the middle, the top 2 bars is when you combine that is probably like 36%. And that's the number of people who have some kind of computer science training, even up to like an associate's degree. So most of the computer science teachers that we talked to didn't have any formal computer science training. And that means that whatever experience that they have in computer science, well, I was telling Michael this story coming. If I just learned in a workshop to assemble computers, like take about a tower and put it back together, I can talk about that experience in my job interview and I can get a job as a computer science teacher. I'll be expected to teach programming robotics competencies. Also, there's all the challenges that teachers are facing. Limited resources, that is not a surprise, but like extra academic and administrative responsibilities. If you happen to be the computer science teacher, you are now the person who will upload all grades and email all parents because you have the technical skills. Right? So you can imagine just being a computer science teacher, all the additional administrative responsibilities that come to you because you have that skill and almost nobody else has that. And on all this, they have to prepare students for this high-stakes exam. And this is just a screenshot of the government standards in computer science. And I want you to compare this to the picture of how teachers can get hired, right? So you have things as Introduction to Computing Productivity Software, which is fairly ubiquitous everywhere in the world, Word, PowerPoint, Excel. But you have communication networks, you have computational thinking that includes programming, algorithms, robotics, AI, right? And so you have to think about how can these teachers support these students? And students have to take standardized exams on these competencies. So I spend a lot of time thinking about that problem, and the research question that we're currently exploring is, what topics do teachers need the most help with? Like, what are things that, just by virtue of living and existing in this cultural and economic context, they know? And what are things that they don't, it's hard for them to reach, and how can we design training for that. And I'll talk about where AI comes in later. So yeah, how can we deploy this PD in ways that are accessible to teachers? And what is the current landscape of publicly available training? How can we innovate using AI-powered technologies? So we partnered with a company called Code, and they're really Kwame AI. If you're in the Africa AI and space, you probably know these guys. They deploy smartphone-based computer science MOOCs. The way that they use AI currently is by having AI in a forum that answers questions, so trained on the materials, trained on just some the teaching materials, the quizzes, and some just textbooks to kind of help support students since they don't have tutors always available. And so when we started working with them, we looked into why are students enrolling in this course. The students who don't have computer science backgrounds, why are they enrolled in this course? And you can see, like, okay, so 41% says I enrolled in this course because I'm interested in technology, right? Good, you're enrolled in a computer programming course. But like 36% said I enrolled to teach somebody computer science. And in that data is computer science teachers, and all those people, by the way, the end is about 2,300 of people who don't have computer science backgrounds, who are learning. But you see, like, a solid 36% says, no, like, this number is like, I want to teach somebody something, it's 180 students. And this is a course that was not targeted at teachers. This is just like a natural attraction, right? This includes people that said they were computer science teachers, computer science teacher trainers, and this is, again, an intro to a computer programming class. So we think that MOOCs, especially like smartphone-based MOOCs, because they're accessible in ways that computers are not, have a lot of potential. And so far as our projects right now, we are partnering with computer science training leaders at Georgia State to provide these teachers with training for at-risk CS competencies. And then we are doing design workshops with the teachers so we can co-design the curricula to ensure that they're responsive to the local cultural context and the local cultural and resource context. If you do this kind of work, you want to partner on just like technology training funding, just reach out to me and we'll talk a little bit more. But I see AI as really powerful in this context to help provide teacher instructional and peer support. I see AI as a thing that can transform and make curricula cultural and context relevant, because, I mean, we live in, even though the US is a very multicultural place, most of us, where we live, there's a culture of education here, right? And it's fairly homogenous. We speak English, we learn in a certain kind of way. When you go, we talked about teacher skill, we talked about student skill, we talked about resources, right? There's also other things like language, right? There's things that are really contextual, and if you don't know all these things, no matter how good the curriculum you bring, it won't work. And so thinking about all these like dimensions of change, it's impossible for any one curriculum, or even any teachers who's adaptive, and I think that's where AI can really help. Also thinking about like teaching materials and learning plans on the fly. When you plan for things and your resources don't match, how do you adapt? And also the integration of computational thinking and computer science into other subjects, which is a way that I think in the US, this is how computer science education in some areas have become ubiquitous, right? Introduce it into the core subjects, and how can we do that with these teachers there? No, we're not the only people thinking about this problem. A lot of other people are thinking about this problem, especially in like preparing students for standardized exams. And why is this important? So the WASI is the equivalent of the SATs. All right? So it's like, why do we need to train AI models to do that? Well, most of the exams going back 40, 30 years are on paper, right? So there's a huge paper-based database of these questions, and students don't really have, and sometimes teachers don't really have exposure to why they get the kinds of questions they get. So it's kind of hard to predict what you should be studying. And so just by taking all these things and putting it into a system, putting some AI, thinking on it, people now know, oh, these are the topics in the curriculum that the government is assessing students on. Right? This is how I can study these things. So it's not like this backwards engineering based on the questions over the last 40 years. That if you have a situation, or like here, where the standards are kind of public, you say, oh, this is what we should be studying. Also other companies, similar things, doing work on homework helping kind of opportunities. Is Tony here? Yeah, so this is Kitabu. This is Tony's company, and they're doing work on personalized one-on-one tutoring with students, doing work to provide teachers with insights on where students are struggling and enroll them to the administration. So a lot of people are doing really amazing work, and there's so much opportunity. And there's also other AI systems that are not really directly connected to education, but also I think are really important. For example, people that are doing indigenous language AI, just like NLP stuff, these are things that are critical in the way that we can integrate these things into education systems. So kind of help with like really thinking about this complexity of customizing education. All right, so that's my little, they told me I had 7 minutes. That's, I think, all I could fit in. How did I do on time? I think that's all I could fit on 7 minutes, but here's all the ways to reach me, and this group, you can reach out to me directly. I'd love to chat with as many people as possible on just thinking about these problems together. And if you already work on this space, even better, so we can learn from each other. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Rembrand Koning. I'm an associate professor at Harvard Business School. I don't do education research per se. I educate MBAs. We can argue whether that's a good or a bad idea at another time. But I do a lot of work in emerging markets. Have done a lot of work on how entrepreneurs learn. Right, so one of the things that's interesting about teaching entrepreneurs is that generally when they're in school, they're not building their business. And then once they graduate from school, maybe right when they graduate, maybe 10 years later, they start their business. And so I told them something, and I am positive they have forgotten it 10 years later. Right, and so when AI hit the scene, one of the things that we got excited about in the Tech for All lab that I run was the potential of AI to be a real-time tutor for entrepreneurs as they're building their business. Right, we can't bring them to Harvard Business School and have them sit in the classroom for 4 hours a day if they're building a tech company in India or trying to scale their small farm, right, outside of Nairobi, right? It's just not possible. So we did a research project recently where we hooked up ChatGPT to WhatsApp, did a bunch of prompt engineering designed for the Kenyan context. It was great to see that. I'm very excited just to look at that website the rest of this talk. And it gave them advice. And then we did an RCT around how that advice actually helped. We did a randomized control trial, evaluating whether that advice helped, right? And one of the things that we see is very different results. For some of the entrepreneurs in the sample, they were able to ask those great questions, going back to sort of what Charles was saying. They had the agency to go out and say, hey, how do I improve my sales? Let's have a conversation. One of my favorite entrepreneurs, and if I had time, I'd show you the full chat, works out, he's like, I'm not having sales. The AI is like, why? What days? He's like, well, the power goes out a lot. There's rolling blackouts. And the AI says, have you thought about buying a generator for your store? And he's like, well, maybe, but I'm not sure if the economics works. The AI then says, hey, here's how to think about whether you should buy this generator. He does the math, works with the AI, finds the generator, buys the generator. We did this all in 2023. At the end of the year, it turns to 2024, it's New Year's. He wishes the AI Happy New Year. On his own, he says, it's been so awesome working with you. Thank you for helping me buy this generator. I can't wait to see what we do next. The problem is, half of the entrepreneurs didn't have that abstract level to use the tool effectively. So they said, what should I do? And the AI says, why don't you try lowering your prices? And if you have a bad fast food restaurant in Nairobi with cruddy food, and you lower your prices and there's lots of competition, unfortunately you don't increase demand. The few people who are your friends who take pity on you to buy from your restaurant now just pay less. And you end up making less money, and you also don't learn how to improve your business. You're taking this very off-the-shelf advice. Right, so we find these very mixed results in what we do. And we think a lot of it has to do with, you need to train people and teach them to use these tools with judgment, to know how to actually engage with them. And that's something that we're now scaling up, not just in Africa, but in Southeast Asia as well. So we've been working with Grad in Southeast Asia. It's like the Uber of Southeast Asia. They have millions of restaurants that sell like Uber Eats here on their platform. We've been trying to build AI tools to help these merchants in like 18 different languages that I don't speak, which is really fun. ChatGPT can do this. Basically learn how to improve their businesses. I think it's a really exciting thing to see in the business world, right? To bring the education not just to people who are in the classroom, but to people in their professional lives. And I think where I'm going to end today, if I'm thinking about the power of AI in the Global South in education, is I'm not sure education looks the same in 10 years. right? I'm not sure that we go into school in the same way, because part of the reason we go into school is that it was really costly to have a teacher go from firm to firm to firm to firm. We have to bring everybody together. But what happens when I can have an amazing CS tutor in my pocket and just start learning, right? The example that I love is, I love seeing the coding games. One of the things I've been doing with my daughter is we go in Claude, if you've used Claude, and they have the artifacts. She's into the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, very sophisticated taste for a 7-year-old. We build video games. So I said, Pac-Man, meet Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. It makes a game, we can play it, and then I can toggle to the code. This is something that I would have had to go to a special class, sign up for. It wasn't distributed in the way it was before. And so if you're interested in this sort of work, come find me, love to talk. We have a lab here at Harvard Business School that we're building. And with that, I just want to hear from our amazing panelists and from your questions as well. So I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Judith, Charles, for such meaningful insights. I always come to these things and I leave with more questions. I hope I'm not the only one. So a little bit more about me. So I'm one of the few at the education school here at Harvard. I come from an extensive technical background. So post ChatGPT, I was in the Bay Area, and everyone was working on some AI-powered product. And I also got the bug. I was like, I want to build something, but I felt very drawn to building an edtech product. And unlike most of the tech firms from the Silicon Valley, I wanted to ground it in pedagogical science and learning sciences. I didn't have the audacity to say oh, I know how people learn effectively, and that's why I came to the ed school. And so when I got here, I was just coming from this tech bubble where I realized everyone was so AI literate, everyone was so very pro AI. And then I came to the education school and it was so stigmatized. And so one of the first questions I want to ask to the panelists is the AI shaming that I've seen in the education sector. And so the question I have is, in my AI literacy work, I've observed a widespread phenomenon, which I kind of call AI shaming, where students are made to feel guilty or intellectually lazy for using AI, and that AI usage is going against academic integrity, right? So to what degree do you think assessments and academic culture as a whole needs to shift in the age of AI so that students are encouraged to use these tools responsibly and effectively rather than feel ashamed or penalized for it? And so a follow-up to that question is, specifically in the global South context, right? Do you think that there is less AI shaming? I grew up in India and I just came from a wedding. I spent the week in India. And I mean, I think in the West, it's almost a privilege to have this very critical look towards AI, ethical bias and all these things. In India, a lot of the teens and the young adults I spoke to, they were very oh my God, this is changing my life, I have access to knowledge and know how that happened. So the question here is, in the global South, is there less AI shaming, especially given that AI can be this powerful leapfrogging opportunity? So would love to hear first from Judith.
At first, when you said AI shaming, I was I wonder if she means shaming people that can use AI or people that can't use AI. They're shaming in both directions. So I guess to start, I have more experience in the US context, but I can kind of. So here, there is, I think about the change similar to how librarians must have felt when Google search became a thing. And for context, my bias is being pro-technology and pro-innovation. That's just I'm just admitting that that's my bias. And so I think that the shaming is more indicative of faculty's resistance to change than it is the students doing anything themselves. So that's my personal feeling about this. I just feel we just need to get to a place where we can change, confront scary things. Because if you've spent 25 years teaching a certain way, you have really hard-held beliefs on how we should teach widely, and all of a sudden the student comes and can do something differently. I'm sure. If you spent 40 years acquiring those competencies and really solidifying your my feelings might be hurt. I might not vocalize it. So how do we get to a place where we, as faculty, embrace change? And again, I want to admit that just by the thing of just being pro-technology and being from a different generation, it might be easier for me to embrace than others. Then I would say from a global South perspective, I haven't spent a lot of time in higher ed classrooms in Ghana or Nigeria to be able to have, I have My perception is that computers are not as ubiquitous as they are here. And so, that can afford students the opportunity to use these technologies without being shamed. And I think there's still the general fascination with the technologies that even the teachers might be impressed by it. Because again, this is like a general fascination, the way that, so I feel like the shaming might be more here. But there's other people who have maybe spent more time in like classrooms. Maybe this is a Tony or Nissy question, and they can maybe chime into whether there's some shaming, at least shaming for people who know how to use technology and whether they should be. Now, I'd like to know you didn't ask this, but the opposite. Is there shaming for people who don't know? Right? Yeah.
So let me add, we have a paper we did on gender gaps in AI usage. And they're what you'd expect. Women use it less than men. One of the things that was interesting with the data we collected is we collected from all over the world. So a lot of these studies are just in the US or just in Denmark. We've got data from India. We've got data from Kenya. We actually did a huge survey of 17,000 people in Kenya. And we find basically women are much less likely to try using these tools than men. There's work on higher education, both postdocs, graduate students. One of the things that you see there that is interesting is that gender gap is often driven by the fact that women are afraid that they use the AI, they'll be questioned as not knowing something. So we see it in every country. It's like wild. This is one of those that's like every country, everything is the same. Global South, not the Global South, Northern Hemisphere, Southern Hemisphere, Western Hemisphere, anywhere you are, right? It doesn't matter. And I think what's really interesting about the result is that, right, men tend to think that, like, I'm a genius, I used AI, no one's gonna question my genius. Women are like, I used the AI, now someone's gonna say it was the AI, it was not you. I have a reason not to hire you. I have a reason not to give you that good grade, right? And so I think this question about how we separate the value out of the AI from the person becomes really important. I think where it potentially binds in the global south is as I think about a lot of the outsourcing work. I've done a lot of work in India, and you think about this huge population that are programmers for other companies overseas. What happens when suddenly they get paired with AI? Do you treat them the same? How do they think about applying AI to their skills? What does it mean in terms of the meaning of their work? Like, do they feel that they're skilled, or now they're just working in the AI factory, if you will? I think really interesting questions unpack there.
Two separate answers, one related to Global South and one related to just the general aspect of all this. The general aspect is that all these conversations tend to be very, very polarized very, very quickly. Faculty tends to be politically liberal and intellectually conservative. So, and yes, as you said, it very often takes them a while to say, oh, damn, I've been teaching this way for 25 years now, I have to change. It's painful. It's a recognition of the world has shifted.
And it's a real pain.
It is a effing pain. So yes, I understand that. But at the same time, well, you're paid to adapt. You're not just paid to continue on your tradition. So that's number one. Number two, yes, the students are gonna be tempted to take the shortcut. They want the easy A. Which brain anywhere doesn't prefer the quick dopamine rush to, the long slog? Yeah. So it forces the professor, the faculty, the teacher to change the way they assess. Oh, well, now it wrote the essay for you. Fine, I want you to analyze whether it was a good or bad essay. Better justify your answer properly. Show me your prompts, etc. Right? So it forces, as you were asking about assessment, it forces us to change the assessments. And it forces actually the students go up the stack, as I was saying, towards the conceptual and the epistemic. Why are we actually doing this? What are the right questions to ask, etc., etc. On the Global South perspective, I certainly understand the joy of having access to a ton of information. Those of us who are old enough remember the days of the 1990s and the internet. And like, oh my God, now we can access the entire planet worth of information. Well, now we access not just the planet of information, we can access cognitive help. And so that is fantastic. But I also understand the caution about well, we screwed up majorly with social networks, in a major way. So it's kind of normal for faculty to say, well, yeah, that this is also going to destroy your ability to think critically. At a time, you were already not thinking critically, dear population. So, yeah, you can understand both sides and be nuanced about how you apply your judgment about these things and just do the right thing. Sorry.
Yeah, no, Judith, to your point, I've spoken to dozens of faculty members at Harvard, and I'm really so curious about some of the faculty members are just, and there's Charlie Nesson, who is the founder of the Berkman Klein Center. He's been at Harvard for 60 plus years, and I talked to him, and you would think someone, in that generation would be very active. He called me up, he's like, Dante, I want to creatively use AI in the classroom. How do I do that? He's the last person you would think, right? And then there are other, even younger faculty members, right? In their late 20s, early 30s that are super anti-AI. So I would love to do a study to understand, what are the kind of personality dispositions that,
That's exactly it.
I think that's something that we need to
It's a temperamental issue. It's a temperament issue.
It really does. So I'll ask one more question and then I'll open up to the crowd. I have many other questions, but I do want to get the audience perspective. So one thing that I think about in the age of AI is foundational learning. So Judith, I also have a computer engineering background, and it was different pre-ChatGPT. It was like you couldn't take a line of code and be like, hey, can you explain it different? And I do think that would have completely changed the way I learned coding. And I think I wonder, I kind of am jealous of college students now that they have access to this. I have weird FOMO for my college myself. But then I also worry, is it taking away, I don't think learning should be always fun and engaging. I think there is such thing as desirable difficulties in learning. And I felt this when I learned German at the age of 17. I grew up with 3 different languages, and you absorb it as a child, right? But at age 17, I learned German. I was like, oh my God, this is so hard. The das are 3, neutral on top of feminine and masculine. And then I realized that I'm so grateful for powering through those desirable difficulties learning German at age 17, and it really set me up for success in my, higher education. So all of that to say, I'm really curious to hear the panelists' view on the role of AI. Does it hinder foundational learning? Does it actually enhance, or can it facilitate foundational learning? So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So of course, have you learned French rather than German? Have been a lot easier, and you have.
Yeah.
So German is harder than English. All right. It's always both. Any new technology has both problems and opportunities. It's just normal. And so one thing I would like to bend is the dichotomies that we always put in these conversations. Of course it's going to help, and of course it's going to hinder other things. Just the invention of script writing had Socrates bemoaning that we were going to be less intelligent because he, at the time, conflated memory with intelligence, because memory was so important. You could write anything down, you had to have a huge memory. You could remember the Iliad without batting an eyelid. Who can do that nowadays, right? So, of course, you get to GPS, of course you're not going to know how to read a map. All these things come at a cost. What's going to be fascinating to see is what types of intelligence are going to be less needed. So you may be imagining a situation in 20 years where raw, how can I say, I can't even define it very well, but raw expertise is less critical than knowing how to manipulate that expertise, right? It's a little bit like, well, I don't need to know the Dewey Decimal Code, I just go to Google, right? So that's the sort of shift we're going to be seeing, and that's the thing that we're not thinking about sufficiently. What strategic intelligence, should we want to call it, or something like that that's going to be more needed, whereas traditional types of hardcore expertise may be diminished. In some aspects, again, it's not the whole thing. We're still going to need expertise, but what type of expertise, that goes up the stack. That was really good.
Yeah, I think I agree. I think that you will, yes, we're going to lose some skills. Yes. But I think that what we define as foundational skills are socially constructed. I don't think they're not set in stone anywhere. So what we think, I bet you that what we thought was foundational skills for math 200 years ago is very different from what it is right now. So when I first learned to write code, Java, I believe it or not, I wrote code in Notepad. I mean, it didn't make indents when you hit enter, right? In Notepad, and you had to run it on the blue MS-DOS screen without, like, you errored and you had no idea why, and God help you with debugging. This is how I learned to write code. And now in the age of IDEs, sure, I was just so glad for my code to work. I didn't, at that point, I didn't care to know what the libraries meant. Like the things I initiated, I didn't know why. I just cared that it worked because it was just so arduous to get things to work. And now, I don't know if like NetBeans are still a thing or whatever IDE people are using nowadays, but it's like, oh, I start tapping this library and it tells me why this library is there. The different kinds. I'm like, oh, this is like higher levels of learning I can now acquire because the tool is allowing me, it's giving me the affordance of learning. So, yes, I'm going to lose some things, but I think it's also going to give us access to just so like other higher levels of instruction. And so maybe the things that we think are standards in today's world, in 20 years, because of the advancements of AI, it's going to be so much harder. And I don't think that's a bad thing, but this, we just have to know that what we think of foundational, it can shift, and that's okay.
I think where I get concerned is I think the way we as educators, whether we're here at Harvard Business School, or we're in Lagos, or we're in India, think about helping people learn is by helping them generate things, right? So like, okay, I'm a professor. How did I get here? Well, I went to school and I took a lot of classes and I, learned to do math proofs and then I learned to do some statistics and then you do writing. And then, okay, great, once you've done that, you go to your PhD school and you write lots of papers and everyone tells you your papers are terrible because you're your first year of your PhD and they really are terrible. You write terrible, terrible papers. But then the papers get a little bit better. And then over time, you get good at generating a paper. And in generating a paper or generating code or generating whatever you teach your students, we also think that helps them build judgment about what is good and what is bad. And so it's only through writing a million lines of code do I get the ability to judge whether code is good or bad. It's only through writing hundreds of papers that I get to the point where I can become an editor and say this is a good paper and this is a bad paper. What I think is different now, the thing that I'm like, I don't know how we adapt, is that generation piece just got automated.
Yeah.
Part of my job is writing business school cases, and I went on ChatGPT with deep research. I wrote 2 paragraphs. It spat back a 14-page case with citations, everything perfect, better than 50% of what my colleagues and what I write. It was a median. It wasn't my best case, median case. But I then had my MBAs do it. Right? I said, hey, why don't you try this? They don't know what makes it good or bad. Like they don't have the judgment to select from what gets returned from ChatGPT. I think this is the big thing that I grapple with because we can like skip this whole step, but we still need that judgment. How we build that skill, I think that's something that we need to think about, yeah.
Well, so that's absolutely the point. People think that creative people just come up with the idea instantly. Absolutely not true. Mozart wrote a lot of pieces no one listens to. Every once in a while, there's a greatest hit sort of thing. But you have to wade through all of that to write a greatest hit. So if you don't have the hours, how do you get there? And that's why people say, oh, why do I need to learn blah, blah, blah. That's absolutely a pathetic question. It's very much like what you were hearing in the early days of Google, of the internet, search. Why do I need to learn anything? I can find it on the internet. Or why do I need to learn my multiplication table? I have a calculator. Or you need to learn enough to ask the tough questions, right? So the same way you have a financial advisor or a lawyer, you need to know how to ask them the tough questions. So you need, again, those higher epistemic layers and conceptual layers to know what is odd in the response you're getting. And so part of it is to understand deeper the material you get. And so, for instance, if you were to automate, or at least describe the heuristics that you use to judge the paper, that would be super important for the students to truly embed. And oh, by the way, you think you had it so hard, I had to deal with punch cards out in Fortran. Who are you?
Oh, yeah.
That was last century.
Well, I mean, before you ask another question, this thing that you bring up is a fascinating thing, because it's like, I completely agree that it's the hardship that you go through that kind of builds this resilience and be able to make these judgments. And I'm just thinking, the immediate metaphor that is coming to my mind is when people grow up in poverty and become rich, right? So it's the hardship, it's all the things that they experienced that made them shrewd business people who won't go back into poverty, right? And then they give birth and then they have these rich children, and somehow they try to simulate suffering, right? They try to make up suffering because the goal is to build resilience. Because they know, because the only way I know how to build resilience is by being poor and suffering, but my children cannot suffer. But the children also they're going to experience challenges that the parents didn't have to experience.
Right. Yeah.
And that too will build resilience. So it's I agree with you completely that this hardships build the kind of judgment and critical thinking that we need. But even if we lose that, aren't there going to be other kinds of hard things that would maybe produce the same kinds of output? I don't know, but it's just a thing for me. Yeah.
And I also had this aha moment. I was in this data class at school, and it's not sophisticated data analysis, and they said, "Oh, use ChatGPT." I'm like, "Okay, sure, I can do it." I'm getting really nice data visualizations. I'm happy, and I had a peer right next to me, and this person was really struggling. I'm like, "Oh, what are you doing?" So I looked at her chat history, and then I had this big moment of realization where she didn't have the jargon, the language to prompt properly. And the way that I describe prompting is really just being very good at giving instructions. And to give instructions, you have to have a very good understanding of the task or job to be done, right? So for those that come up to me like, "Oh, none of you AI literacy work, people are not going to learn anymore," I'm like, no, if you want to be an advanced AI user to the point that you're co-intelligent, you actually have to have a very good understanding of the problem that you're trying to address or the task you're trying to complete. Right? So then I told her she couldn't even have the understanding of a frequency table, right? So because if you prompt I want a frequency table, it comes out. But she was describing it in a language that was very confusing for the AI to understand. So it's something that came up. And Judith, I absolutely love your comment about foundational learning being something more, transient and on the spectrum. Because when we think about the word even foundation, it's just fixed and set in stone and concrete.
Yeah.
Right? So I hadn't even considered that up until this point. But in the age of AI, I do think we really have to think about it in a much more flexible and dynamic way. With that said, we have room for a couple more questions. So, okay, the gentleman, he was so ferociously putting up his hand. So.
Thank you. Yeah, so my name is Mark Zheng. And just now, follow the discussion from Charles and Professor Koning. At the time, I actually played a scenario, trying to entertain Charles, an example about laundry machine, the kind of skill that develop, not necessarily enable you to do a certain job. And then from Professor Koning's example of provide a tool for those entrepreneurs to provide them instruction and equip them skill of using ChatGPT, not necessarily make them a great entrepreneur. So using those kind of things, that kind of allow me to thinking beyond ChatGPT provide all these choice and those answers. There's a skill of making judgment and choice that this particular individual need to have, which you elaborate on. And at the point, I try to agree with what you stated, but then beyond that, I'm thinking down the road, maybe people can build some kind of intelligent being that replicate certain intellectual, or for example, your judgment, Professor Koning, or your intellect of Charles. And then I can call upon those individual, those digital things, help me to evaluate those choice for me. And in that case, we kind of using a term called lay flagging in China's term, basically where there's go to the beach and let those digital things help me to do the evaluation of what's the right choice for me to making the decision. And what do you think about my thinking here? So,
Can I answer that? Yeah. It's the same question, just just to add to it, if I may, especially because of EdTech. You mentioned, Charles, about the way once we started using maps, once we started using Google Maps, we didn't need to know how to use a map, per se. Professor, you also talked about the way when you prompted out the 14-page document, that you knew you had the skill set to be able to query that and see why it was such a good tool, but your students did not. And then you spoke, Charles, about, yes, that deep learning is necessary. Mohamed Goddat, former Google X head, said that when ChatGPT came out, it was its IQ was 180, Einstein's is 160. Now what we have is 1800. It's basically 18 months. So the question now to add to what the gentleman has added is, what's the value of deep knowledge when it's so affordable, so available, and so real time? And there's no way I can compete with that for my 14 and 12-year-old. What will be the point of me asking my daughters to learn how to code and understand the way it's designed when Lovable and Cursor will basically give them something in seconds and even understand the environment within which they're learning? What's the value, here's the question, of deep learning now moving forward?
I love this question.
Yeah.
It is amazing.
So, to both of you, I'm glad you brought it up. I was afraid of bringing it up because when I was telling him, well, you know, what's your heuristic? I'm thinking, yeah, and then I'll automate that. I said, now what?
Yeah.
Right. That's the extent, and that's actually what we're doing. We're using humans to give us their heuristics about the assessments of various things, and then we can automate that. So now, I still do not believe that there is such a thing as a world where the student is completely uneducated, right? You gotta shape their cognitive functions and their social functions. So how do you, So how do you do that if the kid is just at home? You still have to develop some form of expertise and some form of transfer. But yes, to your point, it doesn't mean that we have to start all the way back to how we used to do things. So for example, in the case of reading a map, it's not as much reading the paper map, but it's knowing how to use Google Maps more effectively to find the best restaurant, right? So there's always a step above. I'm going to use a very, very, very geeky example because I'm a double E, right? But in the past, you used to design the system based on single transistors. Then you went on to small chips with small functions on the chip. No one does that anymore. Then you went up to bigger chips and bigger chips. And as you went up, knowledge of a single transistor's behavior is moot. It's completely automated. But knowing how to assemble the big blocks into the magnificent chips we have here with description language is super important. And so it keeps going up like that, where the former knowledge is abstracted away, but there's always a new layer that comes up. The problem is we cannot easily imagine what this new layer is. The new layer might be the ability, as in the washing machine example, is really to adapt to new contexts, right? Things that are actually hard for the AI to do, until the point where they have a world model. At that point, we're really low. And we have to admit that we will have to figure it out presto at that moment.
I think you have a very profound answer to this, so I'll do my simple answer first.
I don't know about that. I'll ask ChatGPT.
Right?
Why should we encourage deep learning? And I don't think that it has to be in coding, because the coding itself might be obsolete in 30 years or 20 years. But I think that, facilitating deep thinking ensures critical thinking skills that are necessary for, and also makes humans human, necessary for innovation, just allows for the creation of neural pathways in your brain, right, that have long-term health benefits. So regardless of how we do it, I think that facilitating deep thinking, critical thinking in some way is a thing that is never going to, it's something that we're not going to ever lose. Question is, in what skill? Now we say in programming, and I'm sure in 5 years it's going to be learning basic syntax be obsolete, right? So what is the next thing we're going to do?
Yeah, no, I love it. So just to give you a sense, 50% chance in 2 years, 90% of my job is done by an AI. Like straight up.
Yeah.
Right, case writing, research, doing data, 50% chance. Like, when deep research launched, like, I had a moment I took a walk outside and stared into the sky. And was like, what were my choices? Why am I here? Maybe I should be a plumber. I think plumbers have long-term job security. So like,
You'll be able to talk as loud as you.
it will not be able to talk as loud as me. That is true. I have something else. I'll go into a different profession on that. Yes, there we go. But on the point, and I love that you brought up Lovable. If you haven't played with Lovable, it's absolutely amazing. It's this like an AI tool to make apps and websites for you. It's just phenomenal, like what you can build. I think one of the things that we're going to see, at least for the next 5 to 10 years, right? I don't know what happens when we get to that world model. Is I think the returns to being a generalist skyrocket versus being a specialist. Right, so it used to be that it was like, okay, you had all these kids from MIT and from Harvard, they learned the secrets of coding, and they went to Silicon Valley to solve Silicon Valley problems. I think what we're gonna see over the next 5 years is that suddenly, someone anywhere in the world, right, if they have those sort of general skills and smarts to find good problems, can start using software to solve the problem. So I'm in Thailand, I can start build amazing apps to solve problems in Thailand. I'm in Colombia, in Bogota, I can start solving problems in a way that you couldn't build software, you couldn't build these tools. And so I do think at least for 5 years we've got this amazing time of sort of generalist flourishing. So if I go back to your daughter, right, I think the switch is it used to be like go really deep, be super specialized. Suddenly I think you can be much more of a generalist, right? And that's a different mindset that we're gonna have to teach people in terms of how to solve problems and how to build their careers. Not to say there won't be incredible specialists in things like quantum physics and stuff like that, but for most students, I think, suddenly there's just a huge amount of opportunity because AI enabled us to do things that we weren't good at before, right? Like, I'm basically dyslexic. I can't write without Word and grammar checking. I'm not a professor. Now with these tools, oh my gosh, maybe I can even write kind of like nice. Like this is amazing, right? I think that's the optimistic take.
And that's why I wanted you to have the image in your mind of the Swiss Army knife, right? You have a bunch of tools and then you can refine the tool depending on the new circumstances. And that's what your daughter needs to learn, the whole thing. So for instance, not just the traditional disciplines, but also entrepreneurship, also technology and engineering, not just computer science, technology and engineering at large, civil, mechanical, etc. All the things that are not taught in school are actually the ones that are important nowadays. So sociology, anthropology, psychology, neuroscience, all these things should be in high school.
Thank you, everyone. Just one last comment from my side. I got a little bit of ego boost when you said it's a generalist flourishing society because I've always identified as a generalist. And I think there are 2 key traits of being a generalist. One is curiosity. When you're trying to be a jack of all trades, you're just so inherently curious. So people ask me like, oh my God, why are you so good at AI stuff? It's because I genuinely am curious and I look on X 30 minutes in the morning, 30 minutes at night, and it's just you need that, right? And the second trait of being a generalist, I think, is agency. Just to be like, I can figure it out. And I think in this day and age, curiosity and agency are such important traits to navigate this level of uncertainty and amount of disruption that we're seeing. And so I think for educators in the room, those are 2 things to really foster in the classroom.
Well,
oh, yes?
critical thinking. We saw the 10 parameters, and that's what it is. We always try to say, well, but those 2 are more important. Actually, all are really important.
Yes.
Critical thinking, creativity, communication, collaboration, curiosity, ethics, courage, resilience, then meta-cognition, meta-emotion. You do all of that, plus identity, agency, and purpose, you might get there.
Drop the mic. All right, thank you so much, everyone.